Hi, everybody, and welcome. And it's a full crowd. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Los Angeles Public Library recognizes and acknowledges the First Peoples of this land. We pay our respect to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Indigenous peoples today. For more information on which territory you may reside on, please visit Native Land CA. And here is Brooke Sheets to speak to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brooke Sheets, and I'm the Manager of Programming and Outreach here at Central Library. On behalf of Central Library and the Los Angeles Public Library, it's my pleasure to welcome you, whether it's your first time here, you're a regular visitor, or you're joining us after a long pandemic's distance. As librarians and library workers, every day is a little different for our staff. For example, just this month, our Teenscape librarians worked with teens to choose the October book club choice, which is White Smoke by Tiffany D. Jackson, a book that's a Haunting of Hill House meets Get Out with a twist. Our Octavia lab helped an entire family make a very last-minute and urgent repair to a bride's veil with our sewing machines. Our history staff helped a patron with their grandfather's naturalization records so that they could pursue dual citizenship. And our international languages staff have been busy helping folks in many different languages to prepare to apply for the Section 8 housing lottery, which will be opening for the first time in 5 years later this month. Every day, we get to help make lives better in big and small ways and help our visitors find community. As a programming librarian, I want to make sure I invite you to find community in a few of our upcoming programs this month, including our creators in residence, Kwesi Boyd Bolden and River Garza, will be showcasing their work on October 16th at 2 p.m., where you can join in conversation with our creators, or you can get into the season with our virtual film discussion of The Witch on October 18th at 7 p.m., or as part of our Grand Avenue Arts festivities, kids are invited to join us to decorate their own sugar skulls in honor of Dia de los Muertos on October 22nd at 11 a.m. And finally, if tonight's program inspires you to get more informed, or if you just remembered you'll be voting soon, I wanted to let you know that our Eagle Rock branch will be hosting a program on California ballot measures, the pros and cons with the League of Women Voters on October 13th. For all of our programs and more, please feel free to check out our website or take a copy of the Central Library calendar of events. You'll find them on the banister just as you leave. Also, because we're librarians and we always want you to have an opportunity to dive deeper, a list of books inspired by tonight's conversations has been created by some of our history, social science, and literature librarians. This will be sent to you after tonight's program. And now, I'd like to turn it over to Jessica Strand, the Library Foundation of Los Angeles' Director of Public Programming.
Thank you so much. I don't need to introduce myself again, but I'm Jessica Strand, the Director of Public Programs at the Library Foundation. It's wonderful to see you all here this evening for this really exciting program, and thank you so much for being here. Now that the fall season of Aloud is underway, with programs practically every other week, please check out lfla.org Aloud to see our terrific and varied lineup for the fall season. There's something for everybody. For those not familiar with the Library Foundation of Los Angeles, we are a private, nonprofit organization devoted to fundraising, advocacy, and innovative programming in support of the Los Angeles Public Library. Thank you to the many Library Foundation members who are with us this evening. I know a few in the audience. And if you are not yet a member, I hope that you will consider joining LFLA to continue seeing programs like this one this evening. And the programs that we support are programs like Read Baby Read, Career Online High School, Adult Literacy, Tech to Go, which gives everyone with a library card a Chromebook and a hotspot. These programs are initiatives are for Angelenos of all ages and help so many children, teens, and adults improve their lives and achieve their dreams. If joining LFLA is not in your budget right now, join the library. It's free, and with 73 branches around Los Angeles, there's one in your neighborhood. Each branch provides a space to work, a space to think, a space to grow, and a space to learn without any conditions or questions. Everyone is welcome. Now, for tonight's program. I'm honored to be introducing these two amazing men and a wonderful book that all of you need to read. Not only is it uplifting, but it's beautifully written. Rarely are we given such an intimate look at how our leaders craft their voice and rhetoric for the public. In this case, Cody Keenan, Barack Obama's chief speechwriter, zeroes in on an arduous 10-day period in June 2015 when the significance of Obama's words was never more pressing. His responses to the Supreme Court decisions about the Affordable Care Act, same-sex marriage, and the massacre of Charleston's Emmanuel Church had to move, consider, and soothe a nation often divided by hate. As Keenan puts it so aptly, quote, "Grace was what Obama wanted to talk about, the quiet grace that sets a louder example than any shout of hatred." Cody Keenan rose from a campaign intern in Chicago to become chief speechwriter at the White House and Barack Obama's post-presidential collaborator. A sought-after expert on politics, messaging, and current affairs, he is a partner at the preeminent speechwriting firm Fenway Strategies and teaches a popular course on political speechwriting at his alma mater, Northwestern University. Jon Favreau served as Barack Obama's head speechwriter from 2005 to 2013. Since leaving the White House, Favreau has written and spoken about politics and speechwriting to audiences throughout the world. In 2017, he co-founded Crooked Media, where he is a co-host of Pod Save America and host of both Offline and The Wilderness. Please welcome Cody Keenan and Jon Favreau. Thank you.
All right.
Hey.
Hey, buddy.
Hey.
Hey, everyone. It's good to be here with you. So, as most of you probably know, Cody and I worked together for about 6 years, from when I hired you as an intern on the Obama campaign in 2007 until I left the White House in 2013. But we also shared an office together, hung out together in DC all the time. We've been on a text chain together for the last 6 years. That's
Every day.
100, 150 messages a day. So we know everything about each other. And I also knew that you would write an incredible book because you are an incredible writer who is all heart and hold yourself to ridiculously high standards. But even I was taken aback by how inspiring and moved I was, how inspiring the book was, how moved I was, and how nostalgic I was for what we did those years in the White House. So this is all a long way of saying, how did you land on the premise for the book, which is, of all the days we were in the White House, of all the days that you were in the White House for all 8 years, these 10 days that you wanted to tell the story, and what did you want people to take away from this book?
Yeah, let me start by saying thank you, Jon, for hiring me to work on the Obama campaign.
No problem.
And for doing this tonight. Let me start with the important thing. I just checked. It's 3-0 Dodgers in the bottom of the third. My friend Sean is in the back texting. He's like, "This is ridiculous, man. I didn't sign up for this." Before getting into the plot of the book, one of the things I want people to take away from it is the struggle to do good work. And I spent 2,922 days in the White House.
I can't believe you count it.
It's 8 times 365.25. But what's interesting is, what's cool about this is how often you get 2 chief speechwriters for president on stage, and you worked for him for 8 years, and I worked for him for 8 years as chief. I worked for him for 14, but 8 as chief. And most of those days in the White House, you go home happy if you've moved the ball forward just a little bit. Because there aren't a lot of big victories. And that's because those big victories come from those thousands of days where you move the ball forward just a little bit. And so these 10 days stood out not necessarily at the time, because we were grappling with it just like everybody else, but they came clear to me in hindsight. I'll just start by saying it was the Trump years that made them really stand out. But these 10 days that take place in the book, everyone remembers everything that happened in these 10 days, but people are always surprised, or at least my friends I was talking to when I was writing this book, that they all happen in the same 10-day span, and they begin with this horrible act of racist terror in Charleston, South Carolina, where a white supremacist went into a Bible study at a black church, Emanuel AME Church, and murdered 8 worshipers and their pastor. And that's the first day of the book. And then the next day, Barack Obama has to go out and give a statement, because that's what presidents do. And we had to write too many of these statements after mass shootings. And on the third day, the families do something extraordinary. The families of the victims, they forgive the killer at his arraignment on live television. And that just took my breath away. And that kind of changed the tone of the rest of the week, I think. I don't have any data to back this up, but you see all the big retailers start refusing to sell Confederate flag memorabilia. You see the governor of Alabama orders a Confederate flag brought down over the State House. You see it was Strom Thurmond's son, who was a representative in South Carolina. Republicans say bring down the Confederate flag, and his father had run for president as a segregationist. All the while, we've also been preparing for these Supreme Court decisions on marriage equality and Obamacare, and that are going to decide whether or not millions of Americans, working Americans, poor Americans, get to have health insurance, and whether or not millions of Americans get to get married like the rest of us can. And all these questions are kind of coming to the fore at the same time about what is America? What do we believe in? Who are we? Are we going to stand up for everybody, regardless of what they look like or who they love or how much money they've got? And ultimately, we won those cases, which we didn't know was going to happen. So we'd been preparing speeches for every eventuality. And there was a real struggle over the course of that week as to whether or not Barack Obama would give a eulogy at all. And then there was a bigger struggle writing it for him and with him. And, on the 10th day, the Supreme Court found a right to marriage equality, and Barack Obama went down to Charleston and sang Amazing Grace and came back to White House lit up like a rainbow. And that's just the reason I picked these 10 days is because of the sheer magnitude of events that happened in those 10 days, but also what they meant.
You make it sound so easy now that you tell the story. So
well, it took a long time to write.
Just reading about all the versions of the speeches that you had to have for every eventuality for how the Supreme Court might rule on gay marriage or the ACA case while you're trying to figure out the Charleston eulogy. Brutal.
Yeah, and you were there in 2012, the first time the ACA was up before the Supreme Court, and I think there were 5 possible outcomes for that. And you don't want to keep America waiting. We don't get a heads up, we being the White House, as to which way the Supreme Court's going to rule. We find out by watching cable television like everybody else. We find out because we had a White House lawyer in the courtroom who would email us a more detailed reading of the opinion, but that would take 5-10 minutes. So you can't just say, all right, we just found out, Barack Obama will be out here in like 6 hours while we write the speech. You have to have them ready in advance. And so we to do the second time around in 2015, and you figure there's just win or lose for both, right? And the defeat speeches, the loss speeches were excruciating for my team to write. And we had extraordinary speechwriters underneath us in the White House. Not underneath, but part of our team. I worked for Jon, and I had a great team that worked for me. But you're writing these speeches. How does a president talk to the country when 10 million people are about to get their health insurance taken away and millions of Americans are about to be told they can't get married? And we have to work on all those. And then there's one morning where I'm working on them both with my team and the eulogy, and a lawyer comes into our office and goes, actually there are 4 possible outcomes for each Supreme Court case. And I was like, get out.
Slam the door.
Just get out.
Lawyers and the policy people. So you actually start the book with a prologue about the Selma speech, which might be my favorite Obama speech of all time, which I can say confidently because I didn't help write it, so I don't feel weird saying that. And I love it so much because in the 2004 convention speech that Obama gives, which of course he became famous for, I think he reclaimed patriotism from the right. I think in the Selma speech, he redefined patriotism. And in some ways, it is a more mature argument about what makes America America, for all that is good and bad about it. And I was sort of wondering, like, what were your conversations with Obama leading up to that speech? And I think you have a good story about what actually inspired that speech.
Yeah, this is, everybody knows Selma, I assume. This was 1965. A group of marchers led by John Lewis marched out of Selma, Alabama. They were going to march 50 miles to Montgomery, the state capital of Alabama, just to demand the right to vote. And they were met on the bridge out of the way of town. They made it 1 mile out of that 50 before the state police met them there with batons and tear gas and almost killed John Lewis. But they kept going back, and Dr. King came, and their efforts reached President Johnson, who took their refrain, "We shall overcome," in a speech to Congress and passed the Voting Rights Act. And so every president had gone back to commemorate this over the years, but this is the first time a black president's going to go back. And John Lewis introduced Barack Obama that day and even said, if you'd have told me when I was bleeding out on that bridge that someday a black president would come back here, I'd have told you you were crazy. I'd have told you you're out of your mind. And so part of being the speechwriter for that is, there's in some ways there's a low bar because the symbolism alone is enough. And Barack Obama could have just gone and paid tribute to what they did, but for Barack Obama, there's no low bar. If he's got a captive audience, he is going to do something bigger. And I wanted to figure out what that was. And I was fortunate enough that I'd done a lot of reading beforehand, like I do for every speech. And this is going to sound way more grandiose than I mean it to be, but what Abraham Lincoln did with... This is why I prefaced it. This is what a good speech can do. What Abraham Lincoln did with the Gettysburg Address in just in 278 words was he recast the story of America, totally rewrote it.
That's what Obama would say to us all the time when he would add to a speech and then wanted us to cut it down. He's like, I don't need this to be a long speech after he gives us 10 pages.
He'd add 3 pages.
And then he's like, I gave a pretty good speech in Boston once that was only 18 minutes. And then he's like, Abraham Lincoln gave a pretty good speech from 276 words.
Did you know that Barack Obama wrote that 04 speech himself?
All by himself.
Yeah, he's told me that before.
In a bathroom stall, yeah.
But that's why I preface this by saying it's grandiose. And I stole this idea from an article written by Gary Wills in the New York Review of Books, which is that Abraham Lincoln in one speech recast the story of America. We were not a government of and for and by the people before that. And so I started thinking, how could we do that with Barack Obama? And this was a really good chance to do that. And what actually gave us the spark, there was 2 things. There was 2 days before the speech. The speech was March 7th, 2015, 3 months before the events of this book. And I'll get to why they tie into this book. It snowed in Washington. And when it snows more than a couple inches, they usually shut down the federal government just to keep... you've got 200,000 federal employees who drive into work every morning and you just keep them home. And so I was praying, hoping and praying for a snow day. And when that email comes through that morning, I was so excited because I didn't want to stay home. I wanted to go to the office because I knew his meetings would be pulled down and I could get him all day long, which is really, really rare because he's just got meetings all day long. And in one day, he and I passed 5 drafts back and forth and each one got better. And that was our dream, because President Obama always viewed speechwriting as a collaboration, and you just don't get to do that often. He doesn't have the time to do that. But another way to get a great idea out of him is to kind of piss him off a little bit. And fortunately for me, Rudy Giuliani, pause for laughter, had gone on Fox News the week before, maybe 2 weeks before, and just kind of... sweated his way. He's never been a really good kind of right winger, riling up the base. He pretends to play the part, but you can see him sweating. And
he's had a few at that point.
Yeah, he's like, Barack Obama's not one of us. He wasn't raised like we were. He doesn't love America like we do. And I'm just like, this is a public library, so I'm just like, F you, But I still thought, I'm going to tell the boss. I'm going to make sure the boss knows. And I brought this up to him, and he goes, well, who the F cares what Rudy Giuliani has to say?
Which was the right answer.
Which is the right answer. But I knew this is what I was hoping for. And then, he fiddled with the bait a little bit. He said, but it's an idea worth taking on. And what does it mean to be an American, and who gets to decide what that means? You've got. I'm tired of Real America and Sarah Palin and flag pins, and that's part of America. But there are all sorts of different Americas in this country that are just as valid. So I'd argue that John Lewis getting his head cracked in on that bridge in Selma, that's pretty American, just marching for the right to vote. So why don't we make this is what that speech should be about? And this is when he gave the speech its thesis, which I stole for the book. And it's that Selma was not a clash of armies, but a clash of wills. It was a contest to determine the true meaning of America. And you can say the same thing about our politics. I mean, we live through it every day now in faster and faster cycles. Everything we're doing, these midterms, every election, everything that happens every day is a contest to determine the true meaning of America. And that's why I made this the prologue to the book, because the events of these 10 days were whether or not America is going to come true.
Yeah. And it's just, and what he does in that speech, what both of you guys did in that speech is in fact, the real patriots in this country throughout history have been the downtrodden and marginalized people who fought for this country and believed in this country's promise, even when this country didn't believe in them. And there's nothing more patriotic than that.
Especially when this country didn't believe in them, especially when they'd been betrayed. And they wouldn't wrap themselves in all sorts of American flag clothing. They would just show up. And I can't remember who wrote the beautiful essay about how America was not a true democracy until the 60s. And it's always been black people who have made that so.
You wrote this great riff at the end of that speech about how the single most powerful word in our democracy is the word we. And in the book you write, it wasn't particularly profound, but it was the type of line that audiences like, even if it flirted with the kind of sugary rhetoric that Obama didn't. And I read that and I was like, man, does that sum up the challenge of writing for Barack Obama? Because all the time you were like, I want to write a speech that's exciting, that gets a lot of applause, but it has to have the intellectual heft that's not going to make him think it's too cheesy or too rote or too cliche. How did you navigate that? And you got him to include "Yes, we can" as part of the riff of the word "we."
I was just going to say that. He never liked "Yes, we can."
No.
He thought it was
cheesy.
too sugary, too cheesy.
Yeah.
He was not, and this is what I try to teach my students now too. You can't build a speech around a line. It falls apart. You have to build it around an idea and a structure. And Barack Obama could tell if we had come up with this great line and tried to build a speech around it. Ben Rhodes was just backstage with us briefly, and he had to go because his daughter was sick, but he's someone else we worked with for 8 years. And he and I would sometimes just kind of huddle around the keyboard and be like, yeah, that's it. That's the line. And there were speeches that would come back where that was the only thing struck out of it.
He could spot it from a mile away.
Yeah, because he was not a soundbite guy. He wanted to make the big argument. He wanted to tell the big story. And so for that segment, this is actually contrary to the advice I was just given. I'd been playing with that riff for like a year, just waiting for the best place to put it. Because it was a little cheesy, a little sugary, but so was America. Sometimes people want that,
Yeah.
and I just knew, I knew this was the speech for it. And I wanted to tie together the word we into, we the people, we shall overcome, yes, we can, as this generational continuum of America, centuries long. And it came back from him, and he struck, yes, we can. And I went up to him we were on Air Force One on the way to Selma, and I said, look, I get why you did this. You probably think it's too self-referential, but it was never about you. Yes, we can was never about you. And by the way, you didn't come up with it. Dolores Huerta did. Mm-hmm. And I won that argument, and he put it back in, which was really, really rewarding, because we didn't always win when we went up against him.
No. He was always fair. He was and he told us from the very beginning, if you disagree with some of my edits, let me know. We'll talk about it. Either I'll say, you know what, that's right, or I'll say, nope. And that's what it was.
I'll consider it and I'll reject it.
Yeah. You write about how you promised me when you started that you would stay until the very end to turn the lights off. Why on earth did you make that promise at the time? Why? How did you stay all those 8 years?
Well, I made that promise because I wanted a job. John hired me to come work on the campaign, and I was genuinely nervous at the end of the campaign that I am I going to get to go to the White House or not? Because I didn't know how it worked, right? Surely there are people waiting on the wings in Washington who just plugged themselves into those jobs. So John and I went and got beers in Chicago in late November of 2008 after we'd won, and I was really nervous about it. I was like, "Look, man, can I come keep working for you?" And John was like, "Yeah, that's." Did you think you weren't? Which tells you a lot about team. It tells you a lot about what our campaign was like and what we were like. But I made that promise to get a job, but it was also because I just couldn't imagine doing anything else. You'd already worked for him for a long time. You were tired.
I was tired.
I was fresh,
Yeah.
And
by 2012, I was really tired.
Yeah, but the idea of working in the White House was invigorating. But I also joked along the way that when people would ask, how long are you going to stay? I'm not leaving until the Cubs win the World Series. And because I was born in Wrigleyville, and get to come to the White House. And they won the World Series in 2016 and came to the White House 4 days before we left. So that was always true.
You did it. There you go.
Lots of Cubs fans here, okay.
Yeah. So I obviously know your whole life story, everything you've done, all that. But, do you remember when and why you fell in love with speechwriting? When were you like, this is it. This is what I want to do?
It's a very clear, straightforward answer. I was on the floor at the Garden in Boston when Barack Obama gave that speech in 2004.
That was it, huh?
That was it. And I worked for Ted Kennedy at the time. I'd been working for him in the Senate for 2 years at that point. After I graduated college in 2002 and moved to Washington and started working for Ted Kennedy. And we all went up to Boston to work on the convention that week. And as part of our reward...
Patrons of the Richard J. Riordan Central Library. The library is now closed.
Wow.
This is after hours at the library. All right, this is after hours at the library. In Ireland, they call this a lock-in.
The library is now closed.
We're going to get one more? Yeah. There we go.
Está bien cerrada. All right. You guys can all stay. Once you're here, you're here.
Yeah.
What were we even talking about?
You were you were at the floor of the Garden listening to the 04 convention speech.
And it just set my hair on fire. We got, as our reward for working there that week, we all got a floor pass for one night, and it set my hair on fire. And this guy from my hometown who was up there talking about politics like I wanted it to be. And I know you worked with him a little bit on that speech. Not so much worked as tell the story. I know that this is my show, but
now I have to explain. I was working for John Kerry at the time, and I did not think that speechwriting would be my life at that point. But I was a deputy speechwriter for him, and I was at the convention, and my job was to make sure all the speeches were on message for the Kerry campaign and all that. And I get a call from the Kerry's chief speechwriter, now Congressman Josh Gottheimer, who said, "Hey, you got to go take this line out of Barack Obama's speech." And at this time, I'm like, who? He's like, he's the keynote speaker. He's got this line in his speech that John Kerry wants to use. And I'm like, why do I have to go take it out? He's like, you're there. Go take it out. So I'm like 21, walk down the hall. Robert Gibbs is with Obama at that point, and Robert Gibbs had been my boss in the Kerry campaign. So I go up to him and ask him to. I was like, he has to take this line out because the Kerry people want him to. And he's like, oh, that's one of his favorite lines. I'm not having him take that out. You go tell him. So I went up to Barack Obama and I told him to take the line out, and he was like, "Are you trying to tell me I have to take this line out of my speech? Who are you?" And I blacked out for a few seconds, and then David Axelrod came up to me, introduced himself, and he said, "Son, let's walk outside and we'll go rewrite the line together." And so we rewrote the line, and then I was like, "Well, that's the last I ever talked to Barack Obama." And then he hired me to be in his Senate office later, not knowing that I was the person that did that. And then a year later, we're sitting around in the Senate office, reminiscing about the 2004 convention. And he turns to Gibbs and he's like, "Do you remember that little shit who came up to me, tried to take that?" And I was like, "That was me." He's like, "I would have never hired you if I knew that was you." So that's how we all.
I'm gonna intercept somebody's question tonight because somebody almost always asks me, no matter what, do speeches still matter? And if you don't think speeches matter, State Senator Barack Obama walked into the Garden anonymous, and walked out 19 minutes later a global megastar. Speeches matter.
Yeah.
Someone out there is like, damn it, that was my question.
That's. I actually want to get back to that at the end. I wouldn't say it was my question, but it's close. So you write about how even when you became director of speechwriting, you were plagued by the idea that you were a talented mimic who'd stumbled upward into the job. I thought I told you this before I left, but that's how I felt literally every day since I had the job with Obama. And at some point, I guess I kind of thought, like, maybe being a talented mimic is the job. Like, maybe that's just why we're here, is to just try to figure out his voice and channel it and know more. But, like, how did you think about that? And how did you sort of, because, like, watching you sort of grow into the job, which, like, when I left, I was so confident that you would be able to do the job, partly because I knew you were a brilliant writer, partly because you and I shared an office for 2 years, and, like, we did every speech together, and so I, like, knew you were ready. And I could tell that you still were worried that you weren't ready. But especially when Selma came around, when these 10 days came around, I was like, oh, he nailed it. He figured it out.
Well, the idea that you are a mimic, the imposter syndrome, never really went away. Well, no, the mimicry part did. It was because I had the only two people who really know how I can write are you and Barack Obama, and now my poor editor Deanne on this book. When I first told her, the only people who have edited me are Jon Favreau and Barack Obama, she was like, "Oh shit." But you know how bad a speechwriter I was in 2007. No, I think I was probably better than most, but I should not have been writing for him at that point. And you, as a speechwriter, you have to spend time with the person you're writing for. You just have to. It makes all the difference in the world. And I never met Barack Obama on the campaign because he was rightly out traveling the country. I met him for the very first time, and I remember I grabbed you on the way because I was terrified. It was like 2 days into the White House, and Katie Johnson, his assistant, called and said, "The president wants to see you." And I was like, "Me? Why?" So I grabbed Favs. I was like, "What? I have to go upstairs and see you have to come." But I didn't spend a ton of time with him the first 2 years. I really started spending good time with him in 2011. And that's when it starts to move from mimicry into understanding not just what he wants to say. And this could be true of anybody you're writing for. Not just what he wants to say, but why he wants to say it. That's way more important.
Yeah.
And so it takes time. And one of the great things about our White House speechwriting team and the president is that every White House is different, but for ours, because John had worked with him for 2 years, we had walk-in privileges to the Oval. We were in charge of our own edits to speeches, which might sound weird that you're not, but there was an office in the White House that, before us, a different office handled edits to speeches, which sounds crazy. But John corralled that so that we took charge of that. So we got to hang out with him, we got to listen to him, we got to talk with him, and that made all the difference in the world. I still... I just left him in 2011, last year, and I still don't think I ever moved beyond. I never got to the point where I thought, sit back, I got this. It was always, somehow I'm going to let him down.
It's so funny because I did worry about that too, that, like, I would let him down, but I also thought that every time he sent back a draft where he marked it up everywhere or, like, attached 5 written pages, it was also, like, the most exciting part of the speechwriting process, because you're like, oh, now I get to see what he did, and he inevitably made this speech great. And it is interesting because I think, like, the 2 times I've seen speechwriters fail are either when they are kept away from the person that they're writing for because there's other senior staff that's like, oh, it's just the speechwriter, and you'll go through the communications director or the senior advisor or whatever. Or speechwriters who think that their job is, like, that the person they're writing for is like a vessel for them to get their political thoughts out into the world, right? Like, that's the other time. And and one of the most common questions I get asked, and I'm sure you do too, is like, oh, how did you write for Barack Obama on something if you disagreed with them? And I was like, I was lucky in that I think part of the reason it worked is because I was so aligned with his politics and the way he thought about politics. And from knowing you, I feel like you're the same way, Rhodes is the same way, like we all sort of thought the same about politics.
Yeah, the only time I've ever disagreed with him, really, and we were very fortunate because a lot of people don't have bosses. You can say that about marriage equality. I wish we'd done that much earlier.
But even that, and you write that in the book too. It's like that one was interesting because I'm like, I feel like I know where he is, and he's just not. I know where he really is, and he's not there publicly yet.
I'm anxious to see him cover this in the next volume of his memoirs, out 2034.
You'll be long gone.
Long gone. Where were we?
Yeah. No, I'm interested in that one too.
Yeah.
There is you capture one aspect of the job that always worried me. When you analyze every angle and take apart every opposing argument, when you write about everything, you can start to feel nothing. I worried that speechwriting in many ways was making me more dispassionate, colder, harder, and more cynical than I used to be. I definitely felt like that by the end. How did you deal with that and sort of stay hopeful and energized and refreshed?
The only times I thought about leaving the White House early were when I thought that somebody else could give more than I could. If I was actively hindering our efforts by no longer being able to give this job my all. And part of that is we literally wrote about everything, every topic, every issue under the sun. And it would make me an awful dinner partner, for my spouse or for anybody else. Because if we'd be out with people, I would be thinking about arguments. I would be thinking about the speeches I was working on. I'd be totally spaced out. And it was like, where are you right now? And I'm like, well, I'm fighting with Mitt Romney about something. And you because you've written so much, and we wrote millions of words that never made the final cut. Like they'll eventually all be in the National Archives because they get all of our drafts of everything, but. That wasn't even a joke, but it is funny.
Yeah, it used to not be a joke.
It used to not be a
now
joke.
It's a joke.
3 weeks ago, they've been like, yeah. But I would save every speech once an hour. So for the bigger speeches, I probably have about 90 drafts with all sorts of language that never made it. So you're always making every argument at all times. And I would stop feeling sometimes. And a couple things helped with that. One was the letters that we'd get from people. This is a longer story, but when Barack Obama took office, he already chafed a little bit under the bubble. Suddenly you have Secret Service protection and armored motorcades and an armored airplane, and you live in a fortress, and you're no longer just in somebody's backyard in Iowa talking to people. So he wanted 10 letters a day from ordinary Americans, and he made sure that we read them all too. That was an amazing lifeline. But then there are things that pierce through that, like the mass shootings, Newtown, when 20 little kids were murdered in their classrooms. You were still there for that. Charleston, there are things that make you feel and remind you that you're human in doing this job and not just some automaton trying to come up with words.
Yeah, and you need that constantly. So one of the big challenges of writing for Barack Obama is he's a brilliant writer. The other is that he was the first black president, and you and I were definitely not. Can you talk a little bit about how you dealt with the challenge of being a white guy who was writing for the first black president, particularly when it came to the Charleston speech?
I don't know that I dealt with it. I kind of panicked my way through it. And, you're a white guy from North Reading, Massachusetts. I'm a white guy from the north side of Chicago. What on earth could we possibly know about what it's like to be a black person in America? And a really important part of speechwriting is empathy. Yeah. You have to understand your audience, walk around in their shoes, but there's limits to that. You can try. Neither of us have ever been stopped and asked for ID on a college campus or had to have that talk with our kids or worry that we're going to be targeted by a gunman because of our skin color. And he lived with this his entire life. So I always went to him first and asked him. And I'm a little hard. I'm a little too hard on myself and ourselves in this book too, because Barack Obama hasn't lived every life experience. Right. He had to talk to plenty of audiences that he never did manual labor, and he'd go into auto plants. Right. He'd talk to LGBTQ audiences, and so there is no such thing as a speechwriter that has every lived experience. But for the first black president, there was that added oomph that always made it difficult. But that's why, in Selma, thank God, we had that snow day where I could talk to him about it. Charleston was harder because he had no time to talk about it. He didn't want to give the eulogy. And I just kind of panicked my way through it, and he ultimately tore it apart and rescued it. I write. I don't want to give too much away, but I write about this in the book, and I write a lot in the book about what it's like to be a white speechwriter for the first black president, and what it's like to be a speechwriter for someone like Barack Obama. And with the Charleston speech, I knew it wasn't there. I just knew it, and to hand in that draft to hand in him a draft that isn't there is a really low feeling.
Yeah.
And he called me back to the White House that night at 11 o'clock, and we would always go into the residence where they lived to go through his edits, and he had just torn up the back 2 pages in their entirety and rewrote them by hand in 3 hours. And it was beautiful. And it was the first time I ever apologized to him for not getting it there. And this is another reason why it was so great to work for him. Other bosses could have they could have reamed you out, or they could have done even worse. They could have excised you completely and given the draft to somebody else and just removed you from the equation. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Brother, we're collaborators. You gave me what I needed to work with here, and look through this. You'll see your work in there too. And when you've been thinking about this for 40 years, you know what you want to say."
He was right. You're always too hard on yourself because I had those same worries too, but I was like, look, at the end of the day, he's Barack Obama. He's the president of the United States, or he's the one running for president. Like, I went through this with the race speech in Philadelphia in the 2008 campaign. And
I was going to bring that up. You literally had to draft what we call the race speech.
The race speech, right. And then years later, it would be, we need the race speech for the oil spill. It's like, that's not going to work.
Infrastructure.
Race speech for infrastructure. Yeah, that doesn't work either. But I remember I found out on the Saturday morning senior staff call from David Axelrod that Barack Obama wanted to give a speech on race and his pastor on Tuesday in Philadelphia. And they were like, he's campaigning all day, so you're going to have to just do a draft by Saturday night. And I said to Axe, I was like, no, I will not do a draft of this speech because Barack Obama is going to have to give me some input on what he wants to say about his pastor and the last several hundred years of race relations in this country and what it's like to be a black man with a white mother who's lived all over the world and sort of figure that out. And sure enough, like that night, he called me from the campaign trail at like 11 o'clock at night and basically was like, so I have a few thoughts. You've seen it. I have a few thoughts off the top of my head, and then it was like just laid out the entire speech. 1A, 1B. Then I'm going to say this. Then I'm going to say this. And I was just like, okay, yeah, that'll work. That'll work.
If I remember correctly, too, it was St. Patrick's Day, and the rest of us were like, not it.
Yeah, no. I did. I was nervous enough afterwards that I went and had a beer with you guys, I think. The other thing I wanted to ask is he believed, and you write this, that racism is structural, it's pervasive, but that, and you write, he didn't lecture audiences about what they were doing wrong or what they were saying wrong, or that their whole life was built on a historical sin. He didn't shame people for not holding the most politically correct viewpoint on any given issue. He gave Americans the permission to get there on our own, which was a more sustainable path. Why do you think Obama's approach is a more sustainable path? And do you think we're on that path today?
Well, I think it's a more sustainable path, and I mean there is actually data here. He was the first Democrat to win Indiana in 44 years. He was the first Democrat to win North Carolina in 48 years. And he didn't run on the cultural issues. He didn't shy away from them, but they weren't front and center. And the way I put it in the book, he practiced a politics of reconciliation and not recrimination. He did not get up there and blame audiences or scare audiences or scold audiences. And part of that is just, it comes from, he can't do that as a black man. But part of that is because he also believed it. He was raised by a white mother and his white grandparents. I mean, that side of his family is just as real to him as the Kenyan side and the father he never knew. And he would give these speeches where he gave us all the chance to change, to think differently. He put this beautiful line in the Selma speech that he said, what a wonderful thing it would be for the South to rise again, not by reasserting the past, but by overcoming it. And I was like, God, that's a good line.
Yeah.
And that's what he did when he rewrote the back half of the Charleston speech. I had written the phrase "Amazing Grace," and that is where he crossed everything out. And he built the structure of the back speech around "Amazing Grace," which was a hymn written by a former slave owner who saw the light that he had done wrong. And that's what the rest of the speech was about. It's said, maybe we've been blind to the unique mayhem that gun violence visits on our communities. We see that now. Maybe we've been blind to the way centuries of racism still infiltrate the present. We see that now. Maybe we've been blind to the way the Confederate flag stirs pain in so many of our fellow citizens. We see that now. And none of those lines are naive. Of course, he knew, we've known about this for a long time. I've given 14 eulogies after mass shootings. We know that guns are a thing. But it was a way for him to give audiences the chance to get there on their own rather than just go up there and say, you're wrong, you're canceled, your ideas are bad, everything you've ever believed is bad. Because you're not going to win over any voters that way. No one's going to change their mind if you just come out there and say, you're wrong, you're irredeemable, and there's nothing we can do for you.
Yeah, I worry that sometimes today we've lost the ability to realize that persuasion is like the foundation of democracy. Like we may be right about a whole bunch of issues, but just shouting that from the rooftops or tweeting it is like not going to change any minds. And
It feels good.
It feels good,
But you're not going to win a lot of voters that way.
There's been this backlash, I feel like, over the last several years. You hear some politicians say, like, oh, this whole Michelle Obama is great, but the whole when they go low, we go high thing, that we can't do that. And I think it sort of like misunderstands that concept, which is something that Barack Obama believes as well, which is not like, oh, we shouldn't fight for anything. It's that what your whole book is based on, which is these families who watch their family members gunned down in a church, were able to forgive. And that is an incredibly courageous and much more difficult act, and than anything that the killer did, or just saying, or just refusing to forgive. And I think like giving that space is probably so important in politics. And you guys got that in that speech clearly.
Yeah, and we have gotten away from that a little bit. I think Democrats have gotten away from that a lot. And we'd just be better served by, there is such a thing as right and wrong, and we should fight for those things. But you don't have to tell somebody you're wrong and therefore you're bad, even if we think that way.
Right.
But we have to find a way to say, you're wrong, here's why. Give me the chance to change your mind and come on over to our side.
Yep.
And that is what it's built on. And it's harder. It's a harder path, and it's less satisfying. But so is democracy.
Right. And that's where we're all stuck here together, for better or worse. So a big part of the book, as you said, is how Obama almost didn't give the speech in Charleston because neither of you wanted to, which I could not empathize with.
I was
more.
actively rooting against it.
For people who don't understand the plight of a speechwriter and a speech giver, can you explain why the two of you were so initially resistant and why he eventually decided to do it?
Well, I was very selfishly against it because I had just written so many of these, and Jon and I both know. I said this on Pod Save America last week. One of the most helpful things that Jon ever said to me before I took over as chief, and I don't think he even knew, was he sent me this panicked email at 12:30 in the morning on a Saturday night when he was working on the 2012 Democratic Convention speech, and it was just this screed of like, I can't do this anymore. I quit. I don't want to do this. It's too hard. F this. I hate everybody. And I was like, oh my God, you feel that way too? Great. But that's the way it gets when you know there's this huge speech. And one of the burdens of, like, we were good at our jobs, but also he made us look better, and we just knew that everyone in the White House just looked at us to solve the problem. And behind that closed door, there's some magic going on. When often behind that closed door, like, I would have my head in my hands and just or be curled up on the love seat, just like not knowing what to do. And then that's all the selfish part of it. But for Obama, he didn't want to do it because we had done so many of these. And way back in 2012, 3 years before this book, when Newtown happened, and he had to go give that eulogy, he had just won re-election. just a few weeks before 20 little kids were murdered in their classrooms, along with 6 of their educators. And he went and eulogized. Then he set aside his second-term agenda, which he was going to go after right out of the gate, and decided to do something about guns instead. And we knew how long the odds were. We knew the makeup of the Senate made it almost impossible. The one little glimmer of hope there was Joe Manchin, and
As always.
in this case, it's not a joke. Joe Manchin and Pat Toomey, who was a conservative Republican from Pennsylvania, they both had A ratings from the NRA. They were both gun owners. The two of them worked together on a background checks bill, and 90% of Americans supported background checks. Hell, most of them thought they were already the law. 80% of Republicans supported background checks. 70% of NRA households supported background checks. So we ran around the country kind of barnstorming for this bill, and then Republicans in the Senate just block voted it entirely with the parents of the Newtown kids looking on from the gallery. And the president went out and spoke in the Rose Garden, and I've rarely seen him that angry. I've never seen him that cynical. And he came back in afterwards and he said, you know what, the next time this happens, I don't want to speak.
Yeah.
I don't want to speak. What do you say after this? If we decided as a country we're not going to do anything about this, then I don't want to be the one who goes out after every mass shooting and gives the country permission to move on. I just don't want to do it. We have to live with this until we do something about it. Charleston made that a little different with the racial component, but then it was the families of the victims and what they did was what ultimately inspired him to go down there and speak.
And as you write, like, he always knew he was going to speak.
Yeah, one of the most annoying things about him is that he makes you make the argument.
Yeah.
Even if he's already made up his mind, he makes you make the argument in front of him as to why he should or shouldn't do something, even when you know that he's made up his mind. And it's like, please don't make me do this.
Well, I'm really glad that both of you wrote that speech because it was one of the best, and the country needed it at the time. I think we are ready to take some questions, and got a microphone right here, so just raise your hand and.
Hi, huge fan. I haven't listened to Pod Save America in a while though, but it's okay. Given that you guys worked at, in one of the world epicenters, right, for information flow, it's like the White House, the Oval, there's only a couple other places that are like that, Wall Street, San Francisco, Silicon Valley, the London financial market sector. How did you process all that incoming information, to be able to produce, I don't know, how many, what was a slow day draft-wise, 10? What was a fast day draft-wise, 50? How did you do it? How did you process all that information on to keep all these drafts going, especially with the Supreme Court decisions and intelligence intelligence stuff, the Osama bin Laden raid, that happened in 2011, Newtown, which I'm sure you worked on, Favs. How did you just process all that information every day?
The answer is 3,477 speeches and statements over 8 years. We had a media monitor, thank God, that sent around, so we didn't have to proactively look for news. He or she would send around about 270 press clips before noon, and then a bunch more throughout the rest of the day. So the news was shoved at us, but we also had access to some of the best policy minds in the country. We had the entire cabinet. Anyone in America would answer the phone when we rang. If I needed an expert on a speech, I could call. If they didn't believe it was us, I'd say, call me back at this number. It was an amazing power that we abused constantly. And so it's a great question, but when we were writing for him, we would get to the point where we knew what he would want to say, and we would search for ways to kind of bolster that speech and inform that speech. But we also there were no shortage of people in the West Wing who were just coming at us all day long.
I did not take an economics class in college, and I was the president's chief speechwriter in the middle of the financial crisis, so that was tough. But I had Tim Geithner and Larry Summers teach me about credit default swaps and everything, he gave me the whole lesson. And it's so funny, the first time I wrote an economic speech, very Larry Summers, he was like, Mr. Favreau, can you come to my office? I'm like, yeah. And he's like, this is actually not bad. Thanks. But the one thing about the information is there was so much information coming in that part of the challenge was to actually tune some of it out. And especially as the years went on in the White House and Twitter became a real thing, and we had like cable on in our office, and then we weren't allowed to tweet back then, but like we had, you know, our ghost Twitter accounts that we could look at Twitter. Like if you were working on a speech, it was very easy to get caught up in all of the information coming, or just using it as a way to procrastinate. And so at some point, you did have to actually figure out, like, okay, what does the president need to say in this speech? What does the audience need to hear? And like forget about all the news updates, because they were just going to keep coming and coming. So part of the challenge was actually tuning out all the information that we had access to.
Hi. So my question is, are you a good speechwriter because you believed in the person and in his vision for the nation? Could you be a good speechwriter for somebody that you completely didn't believe in?
I think you could. I don't think it would be any fun. It wouldn't be enjoyable. I mean, it's not so much that we were good speakers because we believed in him. That was helpful, but we did share a vision, and that just made it so much easier. And John and President Obama got to hone that vision together in the Senate for 2 years, which is like we had John and I had very different careers, just because he, you know, the first time I met the president was 4 years after you did, and you spent 2 years together in that little office, probably calling him. I don't know, did you call him Senator? Or did you call him Barack? Like,
Yeah, I called him Senator.
Yeah, but
Mostly. But just usually said hi.
you
Try not to figure out either way.
You spent every day together coming up with the message. That's really rare, but that's also a thing I push on people who do come asking me for advice as to which speechwriters to hire. I say spend time with that person. It's less for the speechwriter's benefit than it is for yours.
Yeah, I mean, I think we both could write a pretty good Donald Trump speech. Wouldn't want to do it. But it's a scary thought, but like I know how he talks. We could probably punch that up. Again, wouldn't want to do it.
And he'd probably just read it.
Yeah, right.
I'm assuming that most presidential speechwriters are and have been, like both of you are, Caucasian men. And were there no African American speechwriters of your caliber who would have had that shared experience with the first Black president of being a Black man or woman raised in America? I'm a high school English teacher, and what could be done to remedy that situation so more women and men of color are the ones writing presidential speeches in the future?
Yep, it's a fantastic question I think about all the time. I grapple with it in this book. The answer is yes, there are, not many, and I'll get to the reason why. Terry Edmonds was a speechwriter for Bill Clinton. He was the first African American chief speechwriter, just like one of the world's greatest guys.
Ended up being my boss on the Kerry campaign as well.
I asked the president this once. I asked him, does it chafe you that you don't have a Black chief speechwriter? And he said the system doesn't allow for it. And what he meant by that is it's just there is no, the pipeline in Washington is built for privileged white people. And there are people now that are working to change that. When I was an intern on the Hill, when John was an intern on the Hill, there were no paid internships. You needed to have parents that could afford to pay you. Now that's changed. There are internships on the Hill that pay more than my first salary on the Hill, which was $18,500 to answer phones. We worked in the White House too. By 2015, our speechwriting team was half female, but we still only had one writer of color. And first of all, it's illegal to hire based on color, which is another problem. But this building the pipeline is hard. My firm is working on that now. So basically, my entire career is just following Jon Favreau places. I followed him to the White House. Then John started Fenway Strategies in 2013. I started there 2 years ago. We are now very proudly, we have 16 speechwriters, half female, half writers of color. We're constantly working to build the pipeline. There's a great group called Speechwriters of Color. And it starts with college, building it up. But by the time and it just sounds like excuses, and it is, but by the time we're in the White House and the economy is falling apart, we didn't have the space to be like, let's go out there and just like cast a wide net. It was, we got to work with what we've got in triage. But there are people working on it now from my firm on down, and hopefully, like everything else, it gets better. And it's also not just, I know this is what you're asking, it's not just a box checking exercise. It is, I write about this in the book too, it is having different lived experiences on your team. You know, you don't need 8 white speechwriters to try to write to America. You need a speechwriting team that is representative of America. And the same is true in boardrooms and universities and wherever else. And so that was something we were always hyper aware of and ashamed of and afraid of. And it's getting better. I mean, the chief speechwriter now for Joe Biden is Indian American and just in first generation American and just one of the greatest guys around. So it is slowly getting better, like everything else.
Yeah, it's been a systemic problem in politics and government for a long time, and I feel like it's started to change in the last couple of years, which is a very good thing.
Thanks, gentlemen, for this incredibly illuminating conversation. 2 questions. Jon, you mentioned what your favorite speech was and talked about Selma. My favorite day of speeches was Election Day of 2008, was John McCain's concession speech followed by Barack Obama's victory speech. And both made me cry in profound ways because of what it meant for America. And I was wondering if you guys could reflect on that duality, because it could have gone very, very differently, like if Sarah Palin had made the speech.
Yeah.
And then the next question is, you just mentioned President Biden's speechwriter. If you were in the White House today, how could you help what I think of as a lackluster communications approach to sharing achievement and great ideas?
Both of these questions are all you, but I was going to say.
Thank you.
Well, no, the first one especially because you helped the president write the 08 speech, but I just want to say it's such a good point about McCain's his concession speech that is not made enough. A, it was just a beautiful speech, and B, it was just critically important to democracy. You know, a concession speech is not required. You know, Donald Trump didn't give one. It's not required, but it's really, really important, and it really matters.
Yeah. The thing I remember most about the 2008 speech is drafting it a couple days before and trying to figure out, like, what's the story that's really going to tie this speech together. And I saw on CNN that there was this woman in Atlanta named Ann Nixon Cooper who had waited in line 3 hours to vote that day. And what made it interesting is that she was 100 years old. And I thought about, at that point, we all started talking about it, and we're like, why don't we weave this story through the speech? Because she was born at a time when she couldn't vote for 2 reasons, because she was a woman and because she was black. And imagine all the progress that she's seen in her lifetime since then. And so that's we traced the line. But it was interesting because when they started calling the states, and we realized he was going to win, Tommy Vitor was like, hey, we should probably let Ann Nixon Cooper know that she's going to be in the speech. And so we had our researchers look up her number and everything. So we call, and this very frail woman gets on the phone, and I tell her that Barack Obama is going to mention her in his victory speech, and she pauses for a minute, and she's like, will it be on television? I said, yeah, it'll be on television. And she's like, what channel will it be on? And I was like, it's going to be on all the channels. And she's like, I'm so proud. I'm so happy finally. And it was a real moment. On the Biden thing, look, it is incredibly challenging to communicate anything when you're in the White House. I think that Biden and any president is better when they're with crowds of people, when they're out of the White House all the time. It's hard to do that. It was particularly hard for this president to do that in the middle of a pandemic. I also think Barack Obama is a once-in-a-generation talent in terms of communication. And I also think that even if Barack Obama was president now, the president has to communicate in an environment that is so much noisier, the media environment so much more fractured than ever before. And you guys did this really well in the second term, I think presidents need to figure out more creative ways of communicating than simply going to the Rose Garden and giving a statement. You need to meet people where they are, which is getting their information from all kinds of different sources now, do interviews with different people, do podcasts, all this kind of stuff, right? And so I think it requires sort of a degree of creativity, and also like you just have to do it constantly. I think unfortunately what Trump did is he made everyone expect that your president is going to talk to you all the time. And that's partly because everyone in your life talks to you all the time and the news comes to you all the time. And so people expect their president to communicate all the time. And sometimes I think that the Biden folks, while they try really hard, are still not like, he's not out there all the time communicating. And I just think that whoever's the president always has to be out there constantly communicating. And I think that's the only way to sort of break through the noise.
I'm going to add two things to that in defense of Joe Biden. And one is people forget how many times the world was coming down on us in the Obama White House saying Obama's not breaking through. Why can't he break through? His speechwriters are terrible. His comms team sucks.
Yep.
I remember it vividly. The other is I'd give Joe Biden a little bit more credit. He already became a historically important president by beating Donald Trump alone. And then he has passed more bipartisan bills than Barack Obama. The climate bill he passed is literally world-changing. He got some gun reforms through. He got an infrastructure bill through that we had tried to do for 8 years. He's done some pretty extraordinary stuff. And I think the point John made about the fact that people just expected Donald Trump to be yelling at them every morning through Twitter kind of warped, why don't we see Joe Biden every day? And it's detrimental. There were times in the White House when I made the argument that like maybe Barack Obama should go silent for a few days and let people miss him just a little bit. At minimum, we went dark over Thanksgiving, which Donald Trump never did. He'd like pick some fight Thanksgiving morning and just ruin it. But we did the turkey part, and then we were out of there until Monday.
Yeah.
Okay. So my question is more around not so much like the the rate of communication, but also just like how do we combat this cynicism that I feel like, I remember I grew up, by the way, like I was like watching your speeches at like 8 years old, and like that like made me go out and like protest the, Republican National Convention at one point and all that stuff, like very young. So like, thank you for being that part of like, moving the next generation, but also like now I just feel there's so much cynicism when you're watching politics, and just the expectation is so like low that if anything positive is said, it's just not received with that type of like magical, inspiration. So what do you guys feel, having seen this transition, what do you feel can be done about that, whether it be through like speeches or through communication or through the news, like anything really?
Well, John literally spends his life thinking about this now, so he'll have some good answers. But I'll tell you, like, look, the easy and number one is buy my book.
Yeah.
This will blow.
That's a good one. That's a good answer.
This will blow a hole in your cynicism, because a lot of working in the White House is actually just fighting against cynicism all day long, because Washington is built to grind you down. Congress is built to grind you down. The media is built to grind you down, and we never gave up on that ever. I teach students now who are all 22 years old, and I spend all my time convincing them to go into politics because it is worth their time and effort, and because it can actually be collegial and fun, and a place where you meet your best friends, and a place where you meet your wives, and your partners, and that's what it was for us. All that said, it's easy for us to say because we got to live through that, and there are so many reasons to be cynical right now. But I wish I could remember the exact words of this quote, but John Lovett really put it great once. He said, it is not more fashionable to just be cynical and never be let down than it is to be hopeful and sometimes be proven right. That's much more rewarding than to just constantly think the world's going to let you down, because then you'll never be proven wrong. And trust me, there are plenty of times the world will let you down, and we're careening towards these midterms where there are Republicans who are running promising to overturn the results of the next election, and we may never be able to get it back, and that's a very scary thing. But I also lived through not just these 10 days, but these 8 years, and worked for a boss who constantly reminded us to look at the broader trajectory of America and all the extraordinary things we've done from our founding. because this country was not founded for everybody, and we've gradually made it a place for everybody, and we still have so much further to go, but it's just undeniable how far we've come. And that alone, he would tell people all the time, should give you hope. So, but most importantly, buy my book.
Buy his book. Buy his book. So I just was doing this podcast called The Wilderness, and I sat down with a bunch of different groups of voters all over the country. And that, if you listen to that might not be so inspiring. You might get a little frustrated by listening to some of these voters. But I also talked to organizers in every spot that we went to. And when we were in Atlanta, we spoke to these two organizers who organize people to get to the polls. And there's obviously horrible voter suppression in Georgia. It's worse now that the Republicans passed a voter suppression bill there. But these organizers basically are like, here's the deal. We're going to try to get these people, they're going to have to stand in line for a couple hours. And so what we're going to do is we're going to try to make it as fun as possible. We're going to play music. There's going to be dancing. We're going to hang out with them. We're going to make friends. And they're like, what voter suppression has done is it hasn't just made it harder to vote, but it has made people more cynical to believe that like they shouldn't even try because the game is rigged. She's like, and the only way I can think of responding to that is to make their time in line a little joyful, a little easier, a little more fun, to show that someone else is there to help them, that I'm going to be there. And I do think that, and Cody just made this point, like there has to be joy in the struggle. And if we are trying to fight to win over people on our side, we have to be fun. It has to be enjoyable, right? Like, and the stakes of these issues are enormously high, and they're very serious, of course. But when you're trying to reach a whole bunch of people who don't pay much attention to politics and aren't engaged in politics, which unfortunately is the reality of most people in this country who end up showing up at the polls to vote, like, we have to treat those people like we are trying to entice them to come over to our side, and that this is fun, and that we are not going to be scoldy and moralizing and righteous, but that we are willing to empathize and meet people where they are, but not leave them there. Try to bring them along with us. So I do think that infusing a little joy into our politics is one way to do that.
We have time for just one more maybe quick question answer.
And Obama was always good at that on the campaign trail. Like, he's the only one who has fun on the campaign trail. He does like these stand-up comedy routines, just eviscerating his opponents.
And you know
hilarious.
what? Like, we don't think it's funny, but like, Trump's having fun. Trump's making jokes. They're having a good time at those rallies. Like, we got to start having a good time at the Democratic Party.
Hi, good evening. Did music ever inspire your speech writing process and President Obama's speech writing?
Cody, you have great story. This is the music
I really
right
do.
here.
You're going to love this book.
Buy this book.
Yeah. I tell two, I'm not going to give it away because I want you to buy it. I tell two great stories in this book about some of the best speechwriting advice he ever gave me through John Coltrane and Miles Davis. As far as our own personal playlists, I don't think I know yours. So that'd be interesting to hear. But I usually listen to music. There were a couple dividing lines. If I was struggling and stuck on what I wanted to say, I couldn't have words in my ears. So I would listen to movie soundtracks. I would listen to superhero movie soundtracks like Man of Steel, Dark Knight, because they're just kind of these soaring orchestral, dramatic things. One of my favorites, though, was The Social Network. It was just kind of this like cool techno background.
It's a good soundtrack.
If I knew what I wanted to say, I would usually listen to Springsteen. And in one of my, this is for your wife and mine, the 2015 State of the Union address, Obama and I decided we want this to be like upbeat, hopeful, optimistic. Because like, listen, we've been in office 6 years. The economy's like finally back to 5% unemployment. Let's have a little fun. And so my wife gave me a crash course. I was very late in this, in Taylor Swift. And I wrote the entire 2015 State of the Union address listening to 1989.
But mostly when I picture Cody writing speeches, I picture like Springsteen and like Cody with a beer and like grease on his hands, like he just came out of like an auto plant. That's like Cody's style of speech writing. Very, very American.
What did you listen to?
What's that? I could not listen to music when I was writing because it would distract me too much. But when I was thinking about the 2008 speech, if he won, I was sort of listening to music to make me think about sort of like the history of the moment. And I listened to Change Is Gonna Come by Sam Cooke, and that sort of like inspired the line at the beginning of that speech, "Change Has Come to America," because I thought about that. That song.
The only other time we used "They Said This Day Would Never Come" in a speech was when the Cubs came to the White House in 2016. I was shameless about it. I asked his permission first. I was like, "Are you cool with this?" And he's like, "Yeah, man, it's fine."
All right. Thank you all so much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
It is. Look, I am a hardened speechwriter whose faith has been tested by politics, and have also known this guy forever. And yet, like, I was just wiping away tears when I finished this book, and it made me feel better about life and politics for like a full week after I finished the book. I had like a little pep in my step because I kept thinking about the book. So
thank you, man.
Buy this book. And
thank you.
Thank
you all very
guys.
much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. You need to buy the book. It made us all cry. It's incredibly great book. Thank you for this conversation. I think it gave all of us a little more joy and hope. So thank you. And you will be signing in the lobby momentarily. So get your book and get Cody Keenan to sign it. Thank you guys so much. Really, thank you.